I was born in Poland, in Lodz, on Platz Kościelny 4. My parents lived there for many years. We were 5 sisters, and one was married with a baby. We had a business. We all went to school. We had a rabbi in the house. He came to teach us davening and Hebrew and Yiddish. And the older sisters went to gymnasium. When I was growing up, I don't think they had so much money. And they did not let the Jewish children go to gymnasium. And in 1942, they made a spell that was, we are not allowed to go out of the building and not the house. So at that time they took almost 80 or more teenagers up till in the early 20s. They collected all the people to the hospitals. By then I worked in a hospital. And I was lucky that I was not taken, and my sister, I was able to save her in the hospital. When they said everybody out, and they took the people, but I said, you're not in hospital, don't say anything. So she stayed there, and they took people from the maternity on the 3rd floor, everything through the window. Everything. The newborn babies in the mothers. Well, they did not tell us, they told us where we're going. We went maybe 3 days in the train, and people fainted, and there was no food and no water, and one on the top of the other, and they stopped. We didn't know what it means, Auschwitz. It was in Polish, or Święcim. We thought it's a little village. On the gate going into that place, there was enjoyment. Arbeit macht frei. They said everybody out. So everybody went out, and my sister was with the baby, and the baby started to run on the platform. So there were 2 Jewish policemen, and they spoke Polish to us. He said, leave the baby and go with your sister. So she's talking to me, and she said in Polish, he's not normal. I think he's Meshuggah. And she have the baby. I went with the baby, and I went behind her. And I'm coming out, and there was the how do they call them? Mendele was a German assessment. And he right away, there were lines, men separate and women separate. So my mother stayed with my sister, and I went there. My mother went there, and my sister was staying. I said, I want to go with my mother. So he says, you are too young, you go on that side. I would have gladly gone with my mother. And my mother went there, that was the end that we ever seen our mother. With my sister I was, ever since, I never went 1 minute without her. We were in the ghetto. Before we went, there was a big shul. My mother went quite often down to that shul, a beautiful shul, beautiful. September the 1st, they came to Lodz, to our city. On the 8th, they bombed the shul. Everything was on fire. My father with a friend, they went into the back, that they knew which way to go, because they davened there. And they took out my father, a Sefer Torah, and his friend. And they brought the 2 Sefer Torahs to our house. And with that Sefer Torah, my father came to Auschwitz. We never seen it, but thank God, we hope that it survived. If not, they probably burned it. But he came with that Sefer Torah there to Auschwitz. After the war, I was 70 pounds and survived. There was with us one girl, and she started to cry a day before we were liberated. She said, I'm having a baby. She was a pregnant woman, and she had a baby that time in the street. But the baby was not alive. In the day of maybe 2 or 3 days later, we were liberated. You don't know what hunger could do to people. I don't wish it, I'm the worst enemy to live through a time alive like that. We didn't know what's going to be tomorrow and what's going to be in the morning. We went to sleep, we knew that we are alive. But in the morning, we didn't know that we'll be alive. Nobody survived, only my sister and myself. I have a good life, but I live with the other life also. I cannot get away from it.
And that was that. And then she was summoned. Spiel the piano, lass mal sehen. And she would play and sing, and she would have a plan for me. She was going to get me out of the lager. She just made it very, very not frightening to me, and she said, we will say goodbye. I promise to find you no matter where you are. And I remember going underneath the barbed wire. Anybody asked me, but I am, but I should always tell strangers you don't know. The next thing I know was men around me, and they were French Jewish partisans fighting in the woods. And they took me and carried me to convent. And I stayed with them, I don't know how long enough to know that there was a tzelem in the back of my bed, which being that I come from a town where there was the only Jewish family, I was very familiar with seeing a tzelem. And they were wonderful to me. One day, someone comes to the port, to the door, and the nun tells me to pack up my things. And she said I should go with them. And they took me to in the Kinderheim in Aix-la-Provence de Marseille. When my mother came, she must have been searching for me. She must have been in touch with Jewish agencies. She took us to a family that housed us, and they were not Jewish. They were the righteous Gentiles. My mom and I lived upstairs and all the way up in an attic. And when any time a gendarme would come to the door, they would give a warning, and we had to be it was just my mother and I. I have no idea where my father was, remember. My mother was told to be in Marseille at a port in the middle of the night. They were going to be put on a boat, and they would go to America. And we did go on that boat, but it didn't go right to America. It went to the island of the Azores, it went to Algiers, it went to Casablanca, Africa, where I lived 3 months. You were not supposed to come up on the deck ever. We were all down in the hull. Everybody was down on the hull. Very sick people were on this boat. And a whole bunch of men were there very sick, and amongst those men was my father. And my mother did not recognize him. He was very ill. I don't know. He never told us his story. It was a very unbelievable story. My father was on that boat, and my mother didn't even know it till she saw it. He was a very sick man. We came here after weeks and weeks with this boat on the ocean. We got here to New York. They wouldn't let us out. Roosevelt, they kept saying Roosevelt didn't leave anybody in. It was a quota system. There were people coming on board all the time trying to get us off the boat, but we did not leave the boat. And the only one that would take us in was Rafael Leonardo Molina Trujillo. That was the president of Trujillo in Santo Domingo. There was already a colony in the Dominican Republic. My uncle Louis, my mother's brother, was supposed to have gone to Palestine, and he could not make it, and as a result he was one of the pioneers that went down to the Dominican Republic because he was an agricultural student. He was there in the Dominican Republic when we arrived. My mother did not know it. She had no idea he was there. And thank God my parents, who lived in Washington Heights, I was able to sit with them and very often ask them, Mommy, Daddy, I had a terrible dream. I'm thinking about this. Is it Is it a chulum? Is it a dream, or is it? Well, I don't understand it. So my mother and my father used to sit and used to tell me, no, he says, mein Kind, das hast du gelebt. You lived this. It stays with you. If I talk to people, I was in Florida, talked to people, European people, they have their stories, and I don't want to say anything. They say, oh, you're American? Yes, I'm American. What can I tell you? You know, the old stories, you don't, you know, but it is what it is. Okay.
My name is Ruth Lewis, and I was born in Frankfurt am Main before the Second World War. I was already alive at the time of Kristallnacht, when they smashed all the synagogues and burned the synagogues down. And my family actually lived in an apartment attached to the synagogue, and someone came and pulled us all out of there. And I spoke to friends of mine who were there at the time, who were standing watching as they burned the synagogues, and the people in the crowds cheered. The German people who were around the neighborhood, never mind the rogues who did the burning and the smashing of windows, but the people in the area. And he finally said to his friend, we better leave, we better go home, because something's going to happen to us. The next morning, during breakfast, my father was picked up and sent to Buchenwald, in spite of the fact that my mother was due to have a baby that week. She did have a baby 7 days later, which was born breech, and the doctors had been put in a concentration camp, so the baby died at birth. And my father came out of concentration camp because he had been a soldier in the First World War. And they released, if you could prove that, they released them again. My parents then, in January of 1939, put the four of us, aged 7.5 to 2.5, on a train with a Kindertransport to Switzerland. So we left Germany, the children, left Germany to Switzerland on a transport with 100 other children. They were picked up in a orphanage where my two brothers were left. I was sent to a cousin of my mother's, and my sister was sent to another cousin whose father, who was the chief rabbi of Zurich. We were then living in Switzerland for roughly 9-10 months, and at that point my parents had arranged for us to be transported to England, where my parents had meanwhile left Germany with 4 other children. These were the children of my uncle and aunt. My uncle was the chief rabbi of Munich, and they determined that those children and the parents would never get out of Germany. So my mother took 4 of their children along on her passport, as if we were still around. And then we were taken by the daughter of the president of Switzerland across to France, where we went on a boat on the Channel through to England. In England, we were obviously little children. I was 3.5, and my mother was not allowed. She was an enemy alien, according to Churchill. My father was put in a concentration camp in England on the Isle of Man. Churchill had put all the Jewish men who had come from Germany in concentration camp, being afraid that there were spies mixed in with the German immigrants. It was they were in a house with supposed kosher food. My father was head of that house. They tried to bring them fish and other things they could eat. This was not similar to the German concentration camp, where my father described that they had fed them rotten meat and then had them all stand on a field to dehumanize the Jewish men. And they were all nauseous, vomiting, having stomach problems. My father, when there was no food, he didn't eat. So he wouldn't eat treif and meat, so he wasn't ill, and he tried to do what he could for the people who were standing there in this enforced stand in the field in the German concentration camp. England wasn't like that. My mother came to pick us up from the boat, and the captain of the boat didn't know what to do with us because she was not allowed to come near the boat. But my sister had a picture of my mother, and he took that out, found her, and then brought us to my mother. And we then arrived in England, where we were in the newspaper as children who traveled alone. And we had backpacks, which according to the English newspapers had all of our things in them. They only had our toys. We had suitcases like most other travelers. I'm sure my parents were frightened to death to some extent, but my mother was a very strong lady. And as one of my cousins who lives in Kibbutz Yavne said, if you look around when we had a memorial for my mother, there were about 100 people in the room, all cousins, first cousins, their children, their grandchildren. He said, look around the whole room, none of you would be here if Aunt Eva hadn't made us all go through England. So that he felt my mother was a very strong lady. She knew what she wanted and which way things should be done.
My name is Irene Weinberger Feuerstein. I was born in Czechoslovakia. It was the Carpathian. The town was named Chinadovo, and we lived there, my parents and my grandparents, and life was very nice for the Jewish people when it was occupied by Czechoslovakia. But unfortunately, the Hungarians came in, 1939, and that's when my childhood was kaput, because they were lost for the Jews. We couldn't go to public schools. So actually I have 4 years of normal education. There was a castle in my town, and they had a torture chamber there, and they took Jewish people there to torture. And my mother used to take kosher food for some of them, just to break up the bad things what was going on. I'm one of 6 children, and I'm the only survivor. When the Hungarians joined Germany's policy, they came over the day after Pesach. They took us with saying that they're taking us down to Hungary because the war is coming and there'll be a war and we'll be safer in Hungary. It was day after Pesach in 1944. And they took us to a ghetto. In the ghettos, they treated us very badly. They were beating the Jewish men. They were cutting their beards off. And my mother right away knew that they are shipping us to Germany or something. I mean, she knew too much. My mother read every newspaper, every magazine, and she knew. And the people at home thought that my mother was crazy, which is so hard to understand, because they did not want to believe what is happening to us. And the same thing I remember as a little girl, when things were going on in Poland, way before we were in trouble, and it used to trickle down stories, and my mother would tell what's going on and what we should be more generous, more helping each other. People should be good to each other because the end doesn't look good. And they called my mother crazy lady. And they took us to Auschwitz. And the cattle cars were we were like sardines. We arrived to Auschwitz. And the station there, the tracks were a lot of tracks, a lot of trains came in. And the first horrible thing that happened to me, I saw those men with a black no, blue and white stripe. And they told us to put the luggage down. You will get your luggage later, they'll bring it to you. And these men took the babies and threw them on the luggage. My father went with my older brother, and I went with my mother and the 5 children. I was the oldest. An SS man comes and he says to me, "Du kannst arbeiten?" And I said, "Nicht. Ich bin ein Kranker," which means, "No, I can't. I'm a sick one." And I go to my mother, and he says to me, "No, du kannst arbeiten. Raus and go this way." And when he walked away, yours truly went back to her mother. And he called me some names, and he said, "Du kannst arbeiten." I kept on saying, "I want to be with my mother." And he cursed me out, pulled me away, and it was getting dark already. I was scared. Walk that way. And that's how I was saved to go to the living people, because my mother, my siblings, and everybody else, and they, I was standing at the door alone, and I looked out and I saw my brother in his striped uniform, and I opened the door, I walked, and I said, "So where is Daddy, where is..." And I said to him, "I'm going to see my mother. I'm going to see everybody on Sunday." And he says, "Are you crazy?" He says, "See that? See the flames?" He says, "They're burning them there." And I started screaming. When I screamed, my aunts recognized my voice, my screaming. So they came running and they put something in my mouth, and they said, "Don't worry, we'll take care of you." I just survived because these 2 aunts, these 2 sisters took care of me, because my father told them that if she is with you, please keep an eye on her. So if they would get a slice of bread, they would cut it in 3 or give me sometimes more. And they watched me. When I had malaria, they didn't sleep at night. One held my feet and the other hand my head. So I shouldn't be shaking, and they shouldn't find out and cremate me. And I don't think there is a will of surviving or anything like that. It was bashert. I must believe in that it was meant to be, and that I survived. And I was fortunate enough to make a decent human being out of myself.
My name is Chaim Chariton. I was born in 1938 in Poland, and I was about 2.5 years old when the Nazis marched into our area. Killed most of my family, and we were then wandering around for a while till we were hidden by a Polish family. My mother and I were hidden in a small town called Lopyszka, which is a small town, a little village in Poland. And we were hidden by a Polish family that had relationships with our family before the war, obviously at great risk to themselves. Most of the time we are hidden in a barn in a little hole under the barn, underground. My father, who managed to escape the day the Nazis marched into the village and killed most of the family, was turned over subsequently by the Poles to the Germans and killed. So my mother and I were hidden in the barn for about 2.5 years. mostly underground, day and night, with some rare exceptions. I was about, well, 2.5 when the Nazis came into Poland, and I guess I was about 3.5 or so till about 5.5 when we were hidden in the barn. I was rather young, and it becomes somewhat difficult to, at times, distinguish true memories from things that I've sort of incorporated through my mother's retelling of the events. So the distinction sometimes is blurry. But there are definite events that I recall quite clearly. Being underground, having to share it with, vermin, having to once move out of the barn because and to be hidden in another area in an attic because another Polish family, anti-Semitic, had told the Germans that someone might be hiding us, and they came into the barn looking for us. They did come into the attic as well and almost discovered us up to sort of the last bundle of hay behind which we were hidden. And whether fortuitously or because the German officer had some humanity in him, they turned away at the last moment and didn't find us. I recall when Russian bombs started falling on the barn and on the area, which was obviously dangerous, but at the same time it meant that Poland was being liberated. My mother and I sought out the few remaining Jews that were left in the region, and with them we moved to Krakow. The situation for Jews after the war in Poland was not wonderful. Armed partisans killed Jews after the war as a reflection of the Polish anti-Semitism that persisted, unfortunately. We eventually smuggled across a bunch of borders to eventually end up in Italy. We had to make a decision between Aliyah to Israel or coming to the United States. And in 1949, primarily because my mother's brothers and sisters who had been in the United States, or one who also survived the war in Russia, came to the United States, so we made the decision to come to the US. When I turned 65, in order to get Social Security benefits and so on, I had to go down to the Social Security office in New Rochelle. Met this nice lady and had to fill out a bunch of forms, and then she wanted my birth certificate. I had citizenship papers and I had discharge papers from the US Air Force, but I tried to explain to her that I didn't have a birth certificate, and she wanted to know why couldn't I just send for it to Poland. You know, obviously a lady who had no comprehension of, and not, you know, a negative about her, but it comes back to the importance of the Shoah. I don't think it'll change behavior at the government level, but individual people, you know, school kids, whether they're Jewish or not, and so on, I think, you know, it's not just for Jewish kids. I think it's something that kids of any denomination, of any school, of any religion ought to know about. First of all, because it happened and they ought to understand, because understanding it gives you some better understanding of what, not just Jews, but what Israel is about, I think. And also because it's a huge, important lesson for the world, that the world, as I said, I think has ignored.